I felt a little bit the way I imagine a moth feels flying towards a flame. There was something horrific that was attracting me to it. There was something sublime in the scale of the destruction. This explosion of water coming up from the ocean. It was so powerful to watch it. And watching that make descriptions of these corny films actually seems somewhat more plausible, because we're dealing with fears, we're dealing with narrative, and when you encounter the reality of the force that these explosions produced, you really are encountering something where the narrative equivalent is, and the earth broke in half.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelley Lesher. As a treat for you this holiday season, I'm bringing back Nathan Radke and Lee Kuhn from the UnCover podcast. We had so much fun the last time we collaborated. We just had to do it again. And this time, we're discussing our favorite nuclear movies. These movies have spanned decades, and you've probably seen some of them. Usually, they involve some sort of nuclear disaster. But there are many other kinds of nuclear movies out there. So we're first going to talk about them in general. They have different categories. We are going to miss a lot of them. There are hundreds of movies out there. But we're going to eventually narrow down, agree to watch 3 of them in detail and discuss them in a future episode. Before we begin the conversation, I want to make a couple of corrections. I talk about Japanese movies, and one that I talk about a lot is Barefoot Gen, and I continuously call it an anime. But in fact, I'm talking about 2 different things. First is Barefoot Gen is a manga, which is a type of comic book, but next it is then made into an animated comic book, which is what is an anime. And they are very specific genres, and I do make this mistake, and please forgive me. Look it up if you want to know more about the specifics of manga and anime. The other one is I cannot remember the name of a film that is about a wealthy businessman, and that film is called I Live in Fear. To start off our movie marathon conversation, Nathan gives us a commentary on the nuclear war film. We don't have a bumper sticker, but if we did, we imagine it would go something like this.
The idea of a nuclear exchange was so present in everybody's consciousness for decades and decades, but it was never realized. A nuclear exchange wasn't realized. Of course, we did see Hiroshima and Nagasaki completely devastated by a nuclear war, but that wasn't an exchange. That was very one-sided. And so because it was this thing that was constantly present in our minds, but something that was never realized in actuality, the only way we had to work through these ideas was through pop culture things like movies, video games, and songs. And actually, Lee and I are doing another podcast later today about a video game that never existed called Polybius, which became a big conspiracy theory, CIA, mind control. So we've been doing a lot of research on old arcade games. Shelley, have you heard of a game called Missile Command?
Yes. I used to play Missile Command.
Oh yeah?
I was gonna mention that to you today, because that could almost be an episode of your show in itself, just talking about Missile Command.
Yes. I didn't realize the significance of it until you just mentioned it, that I grew up playing Missile Command.
Yeah, so did I. I mean,
that explains everything for both of you.
Yeah, I mean, Lee's still just a child, basically, and so he might not even remember those days of arcade games. But yeah, so Lee, do you know Missile Command?
No.
Exactly.
But I do know Pong, and that was certainly earlier, right? That was in the actually 70s. And that
True,
was
but
just like that was the best video game until Super Mario came along, in my opinion.
I mean,
Pong?
Pong is less nuclear
Yeah.
themed.
Yeah, it's slightly less nuclear themed.
Is it nuclear themed at all? Is Pong
Well, it's
nuclear?
it's very semantically poor, so you can really like interpret this, I think, in any way you feel like it. It's bombs versus defense, maybe.
Yeah, only if they
No?
were both destroyed at the end. But
Yeah.
Missile Command was amazing because you had these cities and they like missiles were falling on them and you had to try to stop the missiles from falling. And of course, because of the nature of video games, you would inevitably fail. Like there was no way to succeed, and then you just watch your cities destroyed again and again and
One
again.
by one. I want to play it now.
I'm sure that there must be an emulator online.
Yeah, there's gotta be.
But the great thing about the game is, of course, in the end, we all lose because all of our cities are destroyed.
Which, of course, brings a connection to one of my favorite movies, which is War Games.
Oh, okay.
So that was on my list and I didn't watch it yet.
That one was, again, sort of like a formative film from my childhood, which sort of introduced me to the world that I had been thrown into. This, I think it might have been the second time I experienced the idea in a film that at any moment, the entire world could basically be destroyed.
Yes. And it also introduces what people were afraid of, which was computers taking over and then launching nuclear missiles to destroy us all. So taking that human element out of the idea of launching nuclear weapons, which is terrifying.
Right.
Now, Shelley, have you ever read a science fiction novel from the 1960s called Colossus?
No.
Okay, so Colossus was a series of novels that was basically based on this idea, the idea that you would take something like the decision-making process about nuclear launches and give that over to an artificial intelligence. And there was, I think, a film made about that, but I haven't been able to find it. But it was a whole series of books, and it sort of was a very early attempt to try to reconcile this idea of what happens when we try to kind of outsource our decision-making process to something more logical than us. But then the issue is when the logic you're dealing with is the logic of the Cold War, will that not inevitably lead to complete annihilation, which of course is then revisited in war games.
And what reminded me of it when you mentioned, in the end, everyone is destroyed, is of course the computer at the end of war games decides that nobody wins in nuclear war. And so the best recourse is just not to play.
As a kid, I was quite relieved by that. I was like,
Yes.
Oh, thank goodness. That's clearly the right answer. But from a computer AI perspective, would that be the right answer? Because for a computer, like if you did have a situation of tension in which there are two sides that are about to destroy each other, perhaps one way to resolve that is to have them destroy each other. And like, where is the added ethical element that the computer would have to recognize the value of human life? That was something I think was absent from war games.
Well, or to recognize the value of its own life.
Well, it might be able to survive, of course, because it was on the ARPANET. And the whole point of the ARPANET was to perhaps to survive a nuclear exchange. And so if the computer realized that, it might be one of those sort of situations where the AI thinks, well, I'm surrounded by all these sort of these flawed, irrational beings. If they were all destroyed, then the Earth would be a nice, clean, rational place.
The notion of like this kind of unintended consequences of programs. I know for a podcast about movies, I wish I could remember the name of this movie that I'm thinking of, but it's not a nuclear war movie. But what happens is there is an AI that is running in the background of the security services and decides at one point that the greatest threat to the world is actually the American president, and sets in motion a whole series of events with its own security system to kill the president of the United States. And I like this notion of unintended consequences. So there's this, on the one hand, there's just the possibility that, as Nathan is saying, you might come up with the logic that destroying the enemy is the best idea, and so inadvertently bumble into nuclear war. Similarly, though, I'm just thinking it could also decide that we're their problem, and that maybe we should just detonate all the things in the silos right here, and then that maybe it's simply a numbers game, like how many people are in the Soviet Union plus Western Europe versus the United States. So maybe I like this, and I wonder if, since we're talking about films as opposed to history, there isn't this kind of the computer as allegory where it is actually just a question of systems, right? Because I'm thinking like we have this then in Failsafe where there's a technical glitch, but in Dr. Strangelove, it's just the logic of the Cold War. But both times it's completely irrational. I mean, as an outside observer, you would say it's insane. And kind of putting that into this notion, this black box of a computer, I think is narratively really nice, because it's just like, well, here's all this, all the irrational consequences are housed in this new technological device. And we come face to face with the crazy logic that global annihilation is better than having the Ruskies live.
It's interesting that the three films that we've mentioned so far are War Games, Failsafe, and Dr. Strangelove, because I would argue that all three of those films fall into a very specific subcategory of nuclear war films, which is kind of the films that look at the mad logic. And when I say mad, of course, I'm referencing Mutually Assured Destruction. Of course, if you read it to mean irrational, that also kind of works. So all three of those films sort of examined the process through which we could arrive at an unthinkable conclusion, which is, again, annihilation. There's a bunch of other different subcategories, though, that I think we should mention. And one of my favorite has to do not with nuclear war, but with nuclear testing. In the 1950s, there were a lot of films that had the subcategory of nuclear testing causing things to become giant.
Oh, what is your favorite film that caused things to become giant? Because there are, I don't know, 100 of them maybe?
There are so many of them. We had this idea, and Shelley, I'll ask, I think I already know the answer. Does nuclear testing cause things to become giant?
No.
I thought so. Right, so
I didn't even have to think about that.
Citation not needed.
No.
So probably the best one, like as a film, and one of my favorites, is the 1954 film Them! Which is a film that takes place out in the desert. There has been some nuclear testing, which has resulted in the creation of giant ants. Now, this is genuinely a good film, and I highly recommend it. Some of the things that sort of come across in this film is a kind of hopelessness. Like, these ants are simply unstoppable. There are scenes in which you see, like, normally at this time in the 50s, you'd have generals and they'd be the heroes and they'd be able to come up with a plan that would stop things from going wrong. But there are scenes in Them in which generals are just sort of offhand discussing the fact that, oh, this ship has just been sunk by giant ants and this city has just been lost to giant ants. It's, for most of the film, it's simply a force, an unstoppable force that is wreaking havoc, and people just have no option but to sort of flee in the face of this horror. Them! Is an excellent version of this. A bad version of this would be 1957's Beginning of the End, starring Peter Graves, in which nuclear testing has made grasshoppers giant.
I have never seen this one. I've seen Them, which is good. I have never seen giant grasshoppers.
What I would recommend people do if they want to watch it is don't watch the actual film. Watch the Mystery Science Theater 3000 version of the film, which is exceedingly watchable.
Okay.
The Beginning of the End, it was basically just a ripoff of Them. Grasshoppers aren't as scary as ants, and instead of the sort of impressive giant puppets they used for Them, for Beginning of the End, they just took pictures of cities and put grasshoppers on them.
So I think what would be even more scary than ants would be giant spiders. So did anyone do the giant spider version of this?
Oh, there was the Giant Spider Invasion, starring Alan Hale Jr., the skipper from Gilligan's Island. Actually, this would have been filmed, I think, Shelley, in your sort of area, neck of the woods. I think it might have been filmed in Wisconsin.
Ooh.
And were the spiders giant because of nuclear testing, or was this just...
Unfortunately not. They were
No.
giant because of something space, something space.
Right.
Giant Spider Invasion, 1975. It has 3.1 stars.
That's surprisingly high. They basically dressed up a Volkswagen Bug with some big legs and drove the Bug around the countryside. That's how they did that one.
Yeah, it's exactly what it looks like. And of course, the original one of this is Godzilla.
See, now, here is a fantastic film. The original 1904 Gojira, not the American version, not the 1956 American version where they just inserted Raymond Burr in because they were convinced that Americans wouldn't watch a film without a white person in it. But the original uncut Gojira is shocking and horrifying movie.
It is, if you can find the original in Japanese with subtitles, that is the best movie to watch. Absolutely.
I watched it recently because I knew we were doing this podcast, and I thought, I remember Gojira being like a really good metaphor for the dangers of nuclear power. It's not a metaphor in this film. It's overt. No. I mean, it opens with a Japanese fishing boat in the Pacific, and then there's a flash and a massive eruption from the ocean, and the sailors are burned and blinded. And of course, that is a direct reference to what happened to the Lucky Dragon number 5.
Exactly, yes.
And then from there, you cut to a small village of Pacific Islanders, and their village is completely devastated by fire and by radiation. The first 20 minutes of Gojira basically barely appears, but there's several scenes of scientists in lab coats pointing Geiger counters at things and talking about, oh no, this well is contaminated, or these tuna are too dangerous to eat. There's even discussion of strontium-90.
Yes, and it's very much in those first 20 minutes, it's very much an anti-American film.
Oh, yeah. At a time when you couldn't, like, up until 1952, there was an official policy because, of course, Japan was occupied by the American army. You couldn't make an anti-American film up until about 52. There was severe censorship. You could barely even mention Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And so for Godzilla to come out in 54, it's an extremely powerful movie, and it's one that I was sorely tempted to discuss.
So this is not one of your picks?
This is not one of my picks. This was This was second place for me.
All right.
This one was really hard for me not to pick either, but I think a lot of commentary has been done on this movie, and I kind of wanted to talk about something that wasn't Gojira.
All right, well, then let's move on from the danger of making things big. We'll stay in the subcategory of nuclear testing, though. There's another subcategory of that where, rather than making things big, nuclear testing simply ends the world. And I've got a couple versions of this. There's a very, very good film called The Day the Earth Caught Fire.
Where do you come up? I don't know that I've seen this one.
It's excellent. It's British, 1961. This is a strangely quiet film.
That is probably why I have not heard of this film.
Because of the quietness or the Britishness?
Probably the Britishness.
So now this one, a fantastic film. The impetus behind what happens is that the Soviets and the Americans both test like a massive, like Tsar Bomba style nuclear explosions at the same time, which causes the Earth to get knocked off its axis and start to hurtle towards the sun. Which again, that seems unlikely to happen. But the film itself is simply sort of, there's a journalist who's trying to figure out what's happening. There's a lot of scenes of the sky getting sort of redder and redder. People are getting hotter and hotter. The weather is getting stranger. What's interesting is when you watch it now, you don't sort of read it as a nuclear testing movie, but more of a global warming movie.
Oh.
But the acting is very good. The writing is very good. The cinematography, this is genuinely a properly good film. As opposed to, say, Crack in the World 1965, which is sort of the same idea, only what happens is the Earth cracks in half.
Is that from nuclear as well?
That's also from nuclear testing at the center of the Earth.
Yeah, okay. I haven't heard of that one either.
See, this one almost reads more as the dangers of fracking, because the idea behind cracking the Earth is they're going to set off a bunch of nuclear devices at the center of the Earth, which is going to send up magma, which can then be used for energy.
Where do you come up with these things?
Well, I've been in lockdown now for like 20 months.
Yeah. Okay, hold on. If we're doing nuclear testing, I think I have to give at least two shout outs. One to the documentary Atomic Cafe, 1982. Obviously not a fictional account, but is based on military footage, mostly from the American military, but also from the Chinese, about nuclear tests that happen. I remember watching this. I got a copy of it during undergrad, and I was just mesmerized. I mean, I felt a little bit the way I imagine a moth feels flying towards a flame. There was something horrific that was attracting me to it. There was something sublime in the scale of the destruction. I remember the one in the Pacific Ocean, and maybe it was the one with the Bikini Atoll and the Lucky Dragon number 5, where there's all these military ships, maybe aircraft carriers or something from the Second World War.
They were old mothballed cruisers and battleships.
Exactly. And they're sort of around what becomes ground zero for that test, and they are dwarfed. They look like Monopoly pieces. It was
They really do.
ridiculous how small, and then by contrast, how huge this explosion of water coming up from the ocean. It was so powerful to watch it. And watching that makes some of Nathan's descriptions of these corny films actually seem somewhat more plausible, because it's again this. I realize that obviously we're talking to a nuclear scientist who can give me the math about why the Earth wouldn't get knocked off course or broken in half.
Or giant ants.
Or eaten by ants or squished by grasshoppers. But I feel like, again, because we're dealing in film here, we're dealing with fears, we're dealing with narrative. And when you encounter the reality of the force that these explosions produced, you really are encountering something where the narrative equivalent is, and the Earth broke in half, or the Earth plummeted into the sun, you know? So that was, for me, a very powerful movie that I show clips of to my students when I try and explain what was at stake in the Cold War. Like, what is it? There's something about saying, well, you can't have a war with nuclear bombs. And then you see one of these explosions with the ships and the carriers, and it's just overwhelming.
It's a bit of a comedy as well, because
oh yeah.
I mean, remember the scene with the guy putting his kid into like the lead-lined suit and sending him off on his bike?
Yeah,
that's hilarious.
Because they're showing all of these civil defense clips as well.
Right, yeah.
Like the Girl Scouts showing you how to prepare your bomb shelter, and how are you going to protect yourself against a nuclear weapon, and how are you going to survive a nuclear attack. And then they show these massive explosions that dwarf aircraft carriers, and kind of the juxtaposition of that makes you realize, looking back, like there's no way you would have been able to survive this. Yet at the time, we're testing these massive weapons, and people are showing you how to prepare beans in your fallout shelter. Like, there's no way these two things are the same. Like, the civil defense just wasn't going to work. And that's why it's a bit of a comedy as well, because they're moving back and forth between this bomb footage and then what the government was telling the public at the time, which just shows you that it was just ridiculous, just absolutely ridiculous. And that's why I say Atomic Cafe is a bit of a comedy.
I see that now, although I think I've now finally met somebody with a darker sense of humor than I have. Because I read it like very much as a very sobering critique. Like, don't imagine that you can dig a hole in your backyard and you're going to survive this thing. But you're absolutely right. Like, it does put that juxtaposition like squarely in front of you.
And like Lee says, this does make sense then of these sort of absurd ideas that we see in a lot of these nuclear testing films. Giant ants, giant grasshoppers, the giant lizards that breathe fire and are radioactive. Because you need something that ridiculous, need something that over the top to even try to capture a little bit of what this actually meant for us as human beings.
And I bet Nathan thought it was funny too.
I thought it was hilarious.
See?
I'm going to go back and rewatch it now.
No, I'm telling you, the scene where the guy is putting his kid in like the lead-lined suit and then being like, now go off to play, little Bobby, and Bobby's like wobbling off on his bike.
He can't even ride the bike.
Yeah. And he's just standing there with like his blank sort of biohazard mask on, looking at the camera. It's really funny and horrifying.
It's hilarious.
And then when you compare that to like, don't forget to clean up your house. Don't forget, Don't leave newspapers lying around because that will help the nuclear explosion to devastate your house.
Right.
Yeah. Shaming those housewives again.
Yeah. And so that's the other thing that all of these nuclear testing films have in common is that there doesn't seem to be anything you can do to stop these forces. There's nothing you can do to stop Godzilla except ultimately an even worse weapon, which is what leads to the really tragic and sad ending of that original Gojira, which I won't spoil.
Just a special mention only to, because we're talking about testing movies that go wrong, I just wanted to give a special mention to the TV show Chernobyl, because it also was in a slightly different, obviously not a bomb, but a test gone wrong, and here are then the consequences of what happens. And again, this harkens back to something Nathan said. I actually read that as much of a critique of our inability to come to grips with climate change as any kind of critique of the Soviet Union. I felt like critiquing the Soviet Union is kind of easy. And, yes, it was this kind of bumbling bureaucracy and yes man-ism of the apparatchiks within it. You just do what your production quotas say or what the boss wants, and you hush up any problems. But I felt like that was more of an allegory of today's crises than it was actually a critique of Soviet nuclear power stations. But that's a TV show, and it's not a bomb, so I just thought I had to throw it out there because we were on this subgenre. Maybe there's like a subgenre of the test gone wrong, of which Chernobyl might be the only.
Well, there is a subgenre
China syndrome.
I was going to say there is a subgenre of nuclear energy movies in which Chernobyl would fit, which China syndrome would fit, which there's a few others which would fit as well.
But before we go too deep into the sub categories, we're gonna back up and go back to leave nuclear testing completely and maybe go to the subcategory of nuclear war horror. These are those films that try to capture what it would be like to actually be in not a nuclear accident, but a nuclear war. And here we have things like ridiculous propaganda pieces like 1952's Invasion USA and the highly underrated film from 1962, Panic in Year Zero.
And Threads, no?
Oh, we'll get to that one.
Okay.
We'll get to Threads.
Threads does not count as... Okay,
well, we'll get to it, but we need to stop for a moment and pause on this, I think, super unappreciated film, which, judging, you can't see this, listeners, but both Lee and Shelly are looking at me on the screen very puzzled, which makes me think they have not heard of Panic in Year Zero.
I have heard of it, but I have not seen it.
Yeah, and I only heard of it through Nathan because this is the kind of stuff we also talk about in our free time, and was unable to get a copy.
Yeah, it's. I have it on DVD, which gives you some idea of how hard it is to get. Panic in Year Zero, starring Ray Milland and Frankie Avalon. It opens with your typical American family in Los Angeles, and they wake up super early to go on a fishing trip, and they're packing up the car. They get out of town, and LA is destroyed in a nuclear exchange. The rest of the film is basically the collapse of society and decency. It's one of those situations where it isn't the radiation that's so much the threat as the other human beings. It's sort of very Lord of the Flies. It's very Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. It's this idea that without government, in a state of nature, human beings will inevitably both resort and revert to kind of a state of terror like The Purge. So for a film from 1962, it's actually pretty rough. There's quite a bit of violence. There's quite a bit of discussion of sort of the horrors of human nature. And that's an interesting one. But I think that the key ones, nuclear war horrors, are, as you guys have mentioned, Threads and, of course, The Day After.
Oh, so you'd put The Day After in the horror category?
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure.
Huh.
Well, there's one more besides Threads and The Day After, and that is Dead Man's Letters out of Russia.
Ooh, which I don't know.
So it's in the same thread, pun intended, but it is what happens after a nuclear explosion at a U.S. military base that leaves the whole world scorched, but it's from the Soviet side.
What year is it?
1986.
All right.
Okay, so that puts it after Threads and The Day After, but still like well in that kind of 1980s Cold War milieu.
They're in kind of this radioactive ruins. They're in a bunker, and they're trying to figure out how to survive after a nuclear apocalypse. And so I would rate what the depression scale is. So The Day After is depressing. Threads is more depressing. Dead Man's Letters, even more depressing.
Oh, I've got to see this thing. But if it was made in the Soviet Union at that time, it must have been made with the approval of the Kremlin. Like, I can't imagine that something like that could have been made without some kind of official approval.
Although we are, not to geek out too much here, we are in the period of perestroika and glasnost, so there is a bit of loosening up of things. All just to say that the Soviet Union in 1986 is maybe somewhat more permissive than it would have been in the heyday of the kind of totalitarian state police that we often associate with it.
All right, we can back up out of the nuclear war horror genre and talk about the post-war dystopia genre. This is, the war is over. It's not depicting what actually happens in the war itself. This is after the war. This is when you get into things like the bizarre 1959 film On the Beach.
Oh, I love this movie.
I watched it again.
And?
It's a strange film. It really is a strange film. It was an interesting take on it. I mean, in a way, I feel like a lot of the films that I watched were actually the same film from different perspectives. Like Dr. Strangelove and Failsafe are about the kind of upper echelons of power, the decision makers, and how they, create the problem. A film like The Day After, and maybe The Big Snit, is sort of what happens to just everyday citizens from their perspective as they're going through it. I liked On the Beach it had a really unique take on the whole genre of what happens afterwards. They're not trying to scrape together food in some devastated zone. I don't even have really words to describe what I'm both thinking and feeling, but it's this. It actually reminds me of a couple of other disaster films that have the end of the world as a given, and then the film is just, well, what do you do now? There's that Canadian film
Last Night
by Don
which
McKellar.
is
just that. They don't tell you what it is. They don't tell you, I mean, it could be an asteroid or something like that. And then it's just, what is life like for the last couple of weeks for humanity on the planet when there is no exit, there is no solution to it. I thought it was, for that reason, incredibly dark. And it was actually, Shelley, to come back to our first movie that you mentioned, War Games, I noted this in the true height of Cold War paranoia, 50s and 60s especially, maybe into the 70s, was the films were really dark.
They were very dark.
There is no Bruce Willis who comes in at the end and saves the day by, being a hero and whatever. It's just, no. The end is already, you go walk into the theater knowing the foregone conclusion is it's going to end miserably. And I thought On the Beach, as a result, was a really interesting take, more on human psychology, things about enjoying the last bottles of port or starting a family or kind of trying to live day by day, having a romantic relationship while all of this is unfolding around you. And the kind of, I guess, another theme that that film picks up on, which some of the others have picked up on, you guys noted it, is the kind of helplessness of individuals in these systems. And I think Ava Gardner's character, Moira Davidson, says, something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything wrong here, but I'm paying the consequences. I thought it was a profoundly dark film that didn't show any blasts, didn't show any horror. And I noted that actually in a couple of the films, the less of the bomb and the gore they showed, the scarier the films were for me.
Yeah.
But what was your take on it? Sorry, I just have to say, Anthony Perkins will always be Norman Bates. I know he does Psycho after, but I'm like, I can't unsee Psycho from that man. Like, he is always a psycho after Psycho.
I would like to agree with you don't see any of the gore, but it's a really eerie film.
Yeah.
And it's a very, it's hard to explain the kind of dread and anticipation and the feelings that are brought up with that movie. And you might think it's kind of slow, but it's not, because it just plays on those feelings, like makes you think of what you would do in that situation and how you would respond and what character that you identify with and how you would feel. It really, because of the slowness of the movie, really makes you think and feel, and because it doesn't have that gore. I completely agree.
It's such a great manifestation of absurdity, because there's this realization very early on. We should say it takes, if people haven't seen it, and nobody has because nobody's seen this film, it takes place in Australia after a massive nuclear exchange, and Australia is basically the only place left. Now, what's happening is there's a massive radioactive cloud that is inevitably going to sweep over Australia and kill everybody, and everyone's going to die of radiation sickness. So it speaks to this idea, like, people are planting gardens in this film that they know will never survive. There's that unbelievably tragic scene of Anthony Perkins and his wife talking about their newborn baby. And Anthony Perkins saying, okay, listen, they've got these pills that I'm going to pick up for you. And when the time is right, I want you to take the pill and give this injection to our baby. And Lee, you said when you first saw that, you thought that it was something to protect from radiation.
Yeah, it was such a shocking premise that I couldn't even understand it when I saw it. I thought what he was talking about were these iodine pills that you would take to kind of prevent radiation sickness. But he's not talking about that. It was cyanide pills. And it is just a devastating moment in that film that's sort of how it starts, and it gets darker from there.
There's people who are like, should we start some kind of romantic affair? Well, we could, but we're all going to die. Well, I've built this great car. I'm going to take it for a race, and then I'm going to die. Like, we're going to go on this epic trip all the way to the United States to maybe see if there's some other form of life somewhere, if there's some kind of hope. And spoiler alert, there is not. There is no hope anywhere. Every endeavor they have gets undone because there's an inevitability to the end of everything. Yeah,
so there's so much in two of those scenes that Nathan just mentioned. There's what sounds like a more... it's Morse code, but what is it?
Like a telegraph.
A telegraph sound that they're picking up. But it doesn't make any sense, and it's coming from the States. And so they're like, well, let's go in a submarine.
I don't think you should give this part away.
All right, fine. I won't give that part away. But I will give maybe another part where Nathan said to me that car scene, the race, there's a car race in there that they have. And he says, that's a pretty crazy car race that they have. And I rewatched it, and I don't know if you would agree with me, Shelley and Nathan, but it occurs to me that those racers were committing suicide.
Well, certainly, because I enjoyed the film so much, I read the book that the film was based on. And in that car chase scene in the book, it overtly has the announcer saying, oh, and this person's now dead. Oh, this person rolled over and caught on fire and they're dead.
Yeah.
But there's no sort of sense of loss to it because they were sort of dead anyway. At this point, they were just the walking dead, or in this case, I suppose, the driving dead.
And this is actually something that I found really interesting going through some of these older films, was I felt that as an audience member, I was treated as though I had a lot more intelligence than I am treated in contemporary films. Now, I don't know if that's maybe the genre we're talking about, or maybe it was just something about these films, but there was a lot of scenes like that that were just left kind of shown but unexplained. I feel like today you would have a kind of lab coat geek paired up with some, streetwise cop, and the cop's always like, well, what's going on here? And, the lab coat person explains what's happening so you can move the plot along. And you're kind of put as the audience in the position of the idiot policeman who doesn't know anything and needs to have things kind of laid out for them. And in a lot of these earlier films, like before the 70s, I felt like there was a lot that was implied without being spelled out. And it made viewing these films really compelling, and you actually had to pay attention. Because if you turn off, like in contemporary television, you miss whether it's a cyanide pill or an iodine pill kind of thing.
I want to mention another group of movies that probably don't get as much attention as they should, which is a group of movies that come out of Japan after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these are a movie called Black Rain, which is about how women and men from Hiroshima and Nagasaki are treated after the bombings, and how they are treated as far as like marriage material and the stigma that comes along with being in those cities during the bombings at the time. There's another one, I cannot think of the name of it right now. And it's about a wealthy Japanese businessman that is trying to convince his family to move to South America because he thinks that the bomb is going to hit Japan again. And his family's trying to get him declared incompetent so they can take over his fortune. But the one that I think is the most powerful and the one that sits with me and the one I recommend all my students to watch is called Barefoot Gen. And it is based off of an anime, like an anime book written by Kiji Nankazawa, and I'm probably pronouncing that completely incorrectly, but he was a child during the bombing of Hiroshima. And in order to process what he witnessed, he wrote an anime that was eventually turned into an anime movie. But he is able to do things in this, kind of cartoon that you wouldn't be able to do in a movie. And so it tells a story about him and his brother during the bombing, but also then how they survived afterwards. So I highly recommend that movie.
Well, there was actually a Japanese word for the people who had survived the bombs but had been scarred by the radiation. I think it was hibakusha. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And then, of course, to be hibakusha, there was a lot of people who thought that maybe you were going to be contagious, maybe you could spread it, maybe you would have, it would be hereditary. And so people who were considered hibakusha, there was a lot of discrimination against those people. So it was a kind of unending double horror. There was the horror of the actual experience and then the horror of the discrimination that people faced afterwards.
Yeah, and if you're interested in that, there's a HBO documentary called White Light, Black Rain. And again, I show this to my students because it looks at both sides. It looks at the men who dropped the bomb and it interviews them, and then it goes on the ground and it interviews those who survived. And it is shocking how different the outlooks on what happened are. And I do warn you, it is very, it's graphic and it's also very emotional.
Speaking of discrimination, there's one other post-war dystopia film that I don't think many people have seen called The World, the Flesh, and the Devil from 1959. produced and starring Harry Belafonte.
Harry Belafonte?
Harry Belafonte. Now, hear me out. This is part of one of those. This is one of those films that tried to take advantage of the idea of the neutron bomb, a bomb that would evaporate all the humans but leave all the buildings intact, which I'm sure was completely inaccurate and a myth. But it
makes for a good movie.
It makes for a good movie. It also makes for an easier movie to shoot because you don't have to show the destruction. You just have to film it Sunday morning when nobody's around. But The World of Flesh and the Devil, Harry Belafonte is underground working on a sewer system. A nuclear war breaks out. When he climbs out, he's the only human in New York City. And so he's just wandering around being like, I'm the only person. He then encounters one other woman. And they spend time together and they fall in love. What makes this particular movie so tragic is that it's an exploration of, even after a nuclear annihilation, racism somehow still exists. And it's an internalized racism even on the part of the character played by Harry Belafonte, because he struggles with the fact that clearly these two people love each other. Clearly they're the only two people left. But because she's a white woman and he's a black man, there seems to be still something in the way of them getting together, even though when you watch the movie, it becomes so completely clear that they should. So it's several different kinds of sadness. Sadness of losing all the humans, sadness of holding on to one of the stupidest human ideas.
So are there any happy nuclear war films?
Thank you. I was going to say, I feel like I got
to pipe
Apes. Up. I was going in a different direction. I was going to pipe up with a subgenre that is admittedly very sparsely populated, and that is Cold War and nuclear apocalypse comedies. It's more populated than I thought at the beginning of the podcast, given that Atomic Cafe is apparently now part of that set. I watched, among others, 2 films, both of which I'd seen before, went back to, absolutely loved it. One will be familiar to all, that being Dr. Strangelove. And the other one, some Canadian content for the American listeners. The Big Snit, 1985, is an animated short, which is remarkable for a number of reasons. One is that the nuclear apocalypse is not particularly the point of the film. It just happens to happen anyway, which I thought is itself a really brilliant rethinking of the position of people within these global dramas that unfold. In The Big Snit, you are in the living room of a couple, age, whatever, it's a cartoon, so it's hard to know, but they're a middle-aged couple playing a game of Scrabble. They're irritated, or they get irritated with each other and have a little marital spat, which they are able to resolve just before the end happens. And it is maybe one of the sweetest films that I've recently seen, certainly the sweetest film that deals with a nuclear apocalypse, which again, the 2 characters, actually there's 3 because there's a cat that's quite involved in the storyline. The 3 characters don't realize that the world is collapsing around them. Much like Nathan's characters in the sewage system, they are vacuuming and variously like napping during the major events that push the nuclear apocalypse forward. I thought it's certainly worth watching. I think it has actually been uploaded by the National Film Board of Canada to YouTube. So if you Google it find it on YouTube, you're not even breaking copyright laws. Also, this is very tangential, but a total aside, it's the only YouTube post that I have ever seen that has no negative comments underneath it. I went through at least 100 posts. I mean, I didn't read absolutely everything, but everybody was like, this is such a sweet film. This brings me back to when I was a kid. So I thought that was a really interesting different take on this genre of just, again, how we are so helpless in the face of these broad global movements, and how my life is really determined by my interactions with my wife and my dog and my children and the neighbors. And these global things sort of happen beyond my control. And I found it powerful in a sense for that. Just the sort of, there was also the sense of what really matters and my general helplessness in the situation.
So before we talk about Dr. Strangelove, I do have one more comedy that most people have never heard of.
Okay, because I think we need some now.
Yeah, it's a 2015 movie called Atomic Falafel. And it is I think it's out of Israel well, I'm not sure where it comes from. I found it on Netflix. It is hilarious. It is two teenage girls are talking on Facebook. One is from Israel and one is from Iran, which we know are sworn enemies. And they are trying to prevent nuclear crisis because their dads are like the nuclear people in each of the countries. And it revolves around this falafel truck. But also there's a UN investigator that is going around trying to see if there's nuclear material, and he's allergic to uranium. So if uranium is around, then he becomes like bright red, like he has an allergic reaction. So he goes into a school in Iran and they're like, oh no, this is a school. There's no uranium production here. And he just like breaks out in hives, right? It pokes fun at both countries, not one or the other. And it is pretty funny when you look at these two girls like spilling the nuclear secrets of both countries to each other, not knowing that they're doing anything wrong, and just kind of what goes on in the background.
Oh, that's brilliant.
It's a really funny film, and it's a more recent one.
Okay.
It's great if you can find it. It was on Netflix for a while, but then it went off Netflix, and I haven't seen it since. But
because of all the films that you've mentioned, and I'm going to watch all of them in turn, I think I'm going to start with Atomic Falafel. I think
you should start with it.
I think I'll start with that.
Or you should end with that when you're about ready to take your life after watching the Russian
all the others.
Apocalyptic.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I know that Dr. Strangelove is one that like we all know really well. Probably the audience knows really well.
And also, Lee, isn't this the one that you're going to talk about in the actual episode?
I would like to, but I don't know who's talking about what. So I would like to talk about Dr. Strangelove.
Well, maybe this is the time where we figure it out. Maybe this is the time we figure out which are the films that we're actually going to talk about. And Lee he's making a claim he's planting his flag on Dr. Strangelove.
Well, and I'm just going to throw out for us to think about.
So is that the one you're going to grab then? You're gonna grab Strangelove?
I will grab Dr. Strangelove, although I will be a gentleman to both of you. If either of you choose that one, I will find something else to talk about.
Well, thank you. But as we talked, I decided I am choosing The Day After.
Oh, yeah, okay. Classic.
Well, and it's so much part of my childhood.
Okay.
And growing up in the US, like there's a lot of social context that goes around The Day After that I have to talk about it.
So is it that sort of American context that made you choose it over Threads?
Yes.
Okay, makes sense. Because Threads is so British.
Threads is so British. I didn't see Threads until I was in college, and I saw The Day After when it premiered on US television. So it's a very different attachment. Okay,
so now Dr. Strangelove is very easy to find, I'm sure. The Day After, I have that on DVD, but where could listeners find that one?
I should put a link in the show notes. I think The Day After is on YouTube.
Okay, I think that's true.
Yeah, I think you sent it out. That's right.
Yeah, so The Day After is on YouTube. I will put a link in the show notes. Where can people find Dr. Strangelove?
I think you'd have to go through some kind of paid source like iTunes. That was where I went.
Or if you're at a university or local library.
There's libraries, of course.
Actually, a lot of universities and libraries have services that you can stream it from if you're a member.
Do you guys have Canopy in the States?
Yes, we have Canopy.
So I'm just checking to see if it's in Canopy.
Lee, we don't have Nathan's pick.
Right.
So I am going to bounce off Strangelove, and I'm going to go with Failsafe, the original Failsafe from 1964.
Oh, classic.
Now, this one, if you haven't seen it, I'm definitely not going to give away the ending of Failsafe, because the ending of Failsafe is one of the finest endings in film and book history. Because again, like On the Beach, this was a film I enjoyed so much that I then read the original book that it was based off of by Eugene Burdick. And it is a devastating film. It's a quiet film. There's no gore. There's almost no action. It's basically just people talking. But it is an extremely powerful and disturbing movie. Lee, have you seen this one yet? I know you were going to.
I have seen it. And Walter Matthau plays such a good role. I wanted to smack him upside the head the moment he opened his mouth. Like, because he plays that role so well as this scientist, apologist who is this real kind of right-wing hawk. And his answer to everything is like, well, what, do you want the Soviets to take over the world? And it's that kind of irrational logic that makes me so mad about.
The person you really wanted to slap then was not Walter Matthau, obviously, but it was John von Neumann. Because Mathau's character is 100% John von Neumann in that film. And I'm going to be talking a lot about that on the next episode.
The listeners can't see the finger wagging.
That finger's wagging around. John von Neumann.
I mean, I didn't actually want to slap the actor, just the character he played. He did such a good job of it.
And we talked a lot about John von Neumann in the ENIAC episode on this podcast.
Ooh, yeah. So here's what people should do then if they're listening to this. You should plan yourself an end-of-the-world party.
And we have not given them the most depressing movies they could watch.
No.
Do we have
we dialed it back.
We did. Do we have a recommendation on the order they should watch them?
I have pairings, sort of like wine and cheese pairings. So I would pair Failsafe and Dr. Strangelove because they're essentially the same film, but one is funny and one isn't. And in fact, that was a problem with the release of Failsafe, which comes after Strangelove, is that the original audience thought it was funnier than we do today because it followed so closely on the heels of Dr. Strangelove. They couldn't really tell that it was actually a much more serious take. Those go really well together, I thought. I have other pairings, but I'll let you guys suggest something.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, do we suggest that they watch The Day After first to establish the stakes? And then I feel like those other two films are even more disturbing in a way because you've already sort of have in your head the scenes of The Day After. Or do we have it chronologically? We have the disaster first and then the effects.
I don't know. It could go either way.
Mm-hmm.
I would almost be tempted, though, also to say The Day After and Threads kind of go together. In the same way that...
Day After and Threads go together. Yeah, right? Absolutely.
In the same way that Strangelove and Failsafe. Like, again, these are sort of very similar films, but then different in crucial moments.
Although if you're planning a party in which everyone's going to watch The Day After and Threads, I would suggest that maybe instead, like, go for a nice walk.
Yeah, hide the knives and the sign.
Maybe reach out to a loved one. Maybe, like, even send us an email, just so we know that you're doing okay.
Yeah. Check in.
Yeah.
Check in with us.
Yeah.
Don't drink because drinking is depressing.
Yes.
And so...
Or drink so much you don't remember.
That is not the official position of My Nuclear Life or the UnCover.
No. But wait.
It is not.
It was the go-to method for dealing with these problems in On the Beach. That was something that my wife and I noted, that like alcohol was the self-medication for the end of the world. It was like, okay, so we're going to get drunk in the middle of the day, every day.
In all fairness, that was the go-to method of the 60s, was just to drink.
Yeah. But I was wondering if this was just picking up the culture of the late 50s, early 60s, or if this was actually a nod to how you get over the fact that there is no more humanity left and no future and no hope.
I mean, I thought we were ending this on a happy note, and then Lee has to jump in with On the Beach again. That's it, folks. I hope you enjoyed our discussion about nuclear movies. Check out the show notes and our website at mynuclearlife.com for more information about the movies discussed. There are so many more, as I've mentioned. In fact, I want to give a shout out to the Super Critical podcast, who spends each episode analyzing a single nuclear movie. Thank you again to Lee and Nate from the UnCover Up podcast for another super fun conversation. We will be back in a couple weeks to discuss our chosen movies, so you have time to gather your family and friends for your own little nuclear movie marathon. But after listening to this podcast as I was editing it, I've decided to throw in Threads. Threads is the English equivalent of the day after, so I really do have to throw that in. So technically 3, but I'm throwing in a 4th one because we'll compare and contrast it with the day after. As always, send us an email at mynuclearlife@protonmail.com. Visit our website, follow us on your favorite podcatcher, and tell your friends. Until next time, I'm Shelley Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.